I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Ryan Finnigan. He's a fellow Duke alum. He graduated from Duke PSC in Sociology in 2013. Ryan is an assistant professor of sociology at UC Davis, where he's also an affiliate at the Center for Poverty there. He was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Berlin Social Science Center in Germany. And Ryan's research focuses on poverty, inequality, and social mobility. He focuses specifically on labor markets and housing markets, with special attention to racial ethnic inequality. He also studies poverty, and he examines policies and attitudes. So he has all across the spectrum within the realm of poverty and inequality. And Ryan is a very accomplished researcher in terms of publications. His work can be found in the American Sociological Review, the American Journal of Sociology, Social Forces, among many others. And so we are pleased to have Ryan here to give a talk called Education as a Mechanism for Differences in Intergenerational Income Mobility by Childhood Family Structure. Please give a warm welcome to Ryan.
All right, thank you very much. Sorry, am I on? I think I'm. Sorry, I'm not used to the mic. Yeah, thank you so much for having me out. It's a real pleasure to be here, especially at this time of year, because in California we just get like a light nod to fall. So it's nice to come and see some leaves and some brisk weather and then quickly leave before it turns all the way. So this is just perfect timing. And thanks for having me out. Thanks for the warm introduction, Regina. So this paper picks up on just gargantuan literature on family structure and long-term consequences for adult attainment throughout the life course. It goes without saying there's an enormous literature on the long-term associations between growing up inside versus outside of a two-parent family for children's educational attainment, family structure throughout adulthood, so kids growing up without two parents having higher likelihoods of divorce as adults or not marrying, and subsequent associations with adult income. And so all of these things are, of course, largely endogenous. Things like teenage childbearing can affect educational attainment and subsequently income. Being married and in or out of a dual earner family can affect family income, etc. So there's a lot of kind of temporal sequencing that can be variable, but there's a strong bivariate association, at least, between family structure and childhood and these linked outcomes. And then what's a little bit more up for persistent debate in the literature is the extent to which all of these different associations operate in addition to or through the association between childhood family structure and parental income. And so particularly McClanahan and Sandifer's book in 1994, Growing Up with a Single Parent, What Hurts, What Helps, dove into this quite a bit. And so there's a lot of endogeneity about how low-income families are more likely to experience family dissolution, but at the same time, parental income may explain a lot of the disadvantage that kids growing up from outside of two-parent families face. And so in their book, McClanahan and Sandifer looked at a range of outcomes with a range of data sets, including things like teenage childbearing, high school completion, attachment to the labor force, etc. They found that about half of the association between childhood family structure, particularly single parent versus two parents, with all of those different outcomes, operated through this channel of parental income, having lower parental income for single parent families. And in some of the work that I'm doing in this project today, I also just looked at that very basic bivariate association with adult income. About 80% of this bivariate association that operates here is conditioned away by controlling for parental income. And so there's this kind of big debate about what these channels look like and the endogeneity therein. But what I want to look at more specifically is, rather than trying to understand what the conditional or additive effects of family structure versus parental income might be, but how might there be an interactive association here? So how might growing up in particular childhood family structures moderate the impact of parental income for later life attainment, looking more specifically at education and family income. And so when studies tend to document, sorry, I couldn't get the clicker working, so I'm just going to do a lot of pacing. When studies tend to document these additive effects of growing up outside of a two-parent family and having low parental income as additive conditional on each other, it gives the impression that there might be a double disadvantage for growing up in a non-two-parent family that also has low income. But in a more interactive sense, we can also imagine that that double disadvantage means that there's some sort of acute and multiplicative disadvantage for kids growing up outside of two-parent families that have low income when it comes to something like adult attainment for education, income, etc. And that family structure difference between folks with or without two parents might actually be quite a bit smaller at the upper tail of parental income distribution. And so down here we could think of it as a multiplicative process of a disadvantage. Up here we might think of it as a compensatory process. So high income, single parent, or just otherwise not two parent families may be able to invest in child educational and child care resources that in other ways offset what many folks think of as the disadvantage for growing up outside of a two parent family. Preschool education, high quality early education child care, etc. So a lot of processes by which these family structure differences might otherwise be ameliorated. And so the paper that I'm presenting now, it started with a bit of a puzzle, because I think in the literature this is very much so the implicit and often explicit hypothesis for how childhood family structure and income might interact. So in the review not so long ago, McClanahan and Prochaski said that specifically they expect childhood family structure matters for mobility by creating barriers to upward mobility. And the paper started with the puzzle that research that actually tends to look at the interaction between parental income and family structure tends not to find the pattern consistent with double disadvantage. It actually finds the opposite. And so this is a recreation of some of the main findings by a paper by Deirdre Bloom that was published in Demography last year, where she was looking at exactly this question. So for children of two-parent versus non-two-parent families, how does childhood family structure moderate intergenerational income persistence? So how does family structure moderate the strength of the association between parents' income and children's income? And when that association is stronger, we tend to think of that as stronger intergenerational persistence. Origins matters more for destination. When that association is weaker, we tend to interpret that as more mobility in a positive sense, more opportunity, that where you start out doesn't matter quite so much for where you end up. But she found that the patterns were a little bit more complex than that. And so she used NLSY data, which I'm also using and will describe soon. But you're going to see a lot of these graphs, so I want to take some time on this. We've got parental income down here on the x-axis. Going to the right, we have higher income families. And then we've got children's adult income on the y-axis. So going up, we have higher income. And when you see the solid lines, a steeper angle means that parents' income matters more for adult children's income. That's a stronger intergenerational persistence, which means lower mobility. When you see a shallower line, that means a weaker association. If you were to see a flat line, which I assure you you will not, that would mean complete and total mobility, like an open society where your income in adulthood is not associated with your income for parents. And then it's just logging the actual inflation-adjusted dollars here on the left and using relative percentile ranks on the right. Yes?
Is income adjusted for family size and structure?
Income is adjusted for family size by dividing by the square root of family size. It's total family income that I'm using. Yes?
The difference between parents and children are given the same weight.
That's correct. Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
And I mean, how do you deal? Are these the same segments of adult livelihood? Are they?
Yes, yeah. So in the data slide, so parental income is measured with the years that the children are observed in the teenage years generally. So somewhere between the ages of 14 and 20. For adulthood, it's on average about 10 plus years of adult income from ages 30 through the early 50s.
And are these are different time points, so you adjust for inflation?
Yeah, there are different time points between parents and children, but NLSY, yeah, sorry, it's weird to show a data graph before the data slide, but it's a cohort study. So all of them are reaching the same ages around the same general time points. I adjust for inflation just because like I'm in that habit, but internally it shouldn't actually matter because it's just kind of multiplying constantly across all sample participants to adjust. Mm-hmm. So anyway, the basic descriptive finding that Deirdre Bloom showed in her article is that the vertical distance between the two lines, we've got a line for kids that grew up with two parents, and she's focusing mainly on folks growing up with two biological parents versus any other family structure from birth through age 18. So it's a pretty stringent way of measuring family structure in or out of the two-parent group. And so there's a line showing just kind of the general smooth dissociation between parental income measured in teen years versus adult income measured in the range from 30 to 50, averaged across all of those years as a measure of permanent income. And the vertical distance between the lines would indicate the family structure difference in adult incomes at a given level of parental income. And so down here, this vertical distance would indicate higher income for kids growing up with two parents, with low income parents versus not two parents, also with low income parents. But where these lines diverge most profoundly is at the upper end. So it's children of the highest income parents that have the biggest difference in adult income, not at all this kind of picture of double disadvantage where you would see greater divergence at the bottom of the parental income distribution than at the top. And so given the kind of size of the literature and the strength of the implicit and often explicit hypothesis that upward mobility would be most affected by family structure, it's actually that kids from non-two-parent families have greater rates of downward mobility. So it's less about the reproduction of inherited disadvantage than it is about maintaining advantage at the high end. And then similar studies in the past have found patterns that look like this using education, occupational attainment, et cetera. And so there's a 1999 AJS by Biblars and Raftery where they were looking at family structure and occupational status. And they were very deliberately trying to test the compensation hypothesis that as parents increase their level of socioeconomic resources, they can use that to compensate for whatever the constraints for being a single parent might be in terms of things like time, socialization with children, et cetera, and then ameliorate that difference. But they found, in fact, quite the opposite. And so the mechanism that I wanted to look at, picking up on this somewhat unexpected result, is looking at children's college attainment as the mechanism for differences at the high end. And it's kind of a non-obvious set of mechanisms to test. Well, college attainment is an obvious mechanism, but the literature doesn't actually provide a lot of obvious mechanisms for family structure differences being bigger at the high end than the low end, because it's often been most focused on life course processes that are more common for disadvantaged children than advantaged children. So McClanahan and Sandifer focused on teenage childbearing, dropping out of high school, labor force, disaffiliation, and all of these things are pretty uncommon for high-income children regardless of family structure, and so they don't have a lot of explanatory power for why more advantaged children would see bigger differentiation by family structure than less advantaged children. So I'm going to look at college attainment, and so this is a bit of additional research that points in that direction by Molly Martin, published in Social Science Research a handful of years ago, where she looked at how does childhood family structure impact educational attainment as children grow older, conditional on or interacted with family resources, most notably maternal education. And what she found was that children of two-parent families relative to single mother families tended to outperform their peers, their single mother born peers, when they had higher education, higher maternal education than when they didn't. So for folks growing up with less educated mothers, the difference in test scores, GPAs, average years of education, college attendance, college completion, et cetera, were relatively moderate. Family structure was less important in the absence of high maternal education. In families with much higher maternal education, so down here we've got folks whose parents, and this is using the National Educational Longitudinal Survey, so it's a little bit of an older data, but not older than the NLSY. We've got the folks with low educated mothers here, and then folks with higher educated mothers here. And then we've got the different family structures for children. And so growing up with two biological parents, less educated mothers, the difference in average years of education for children was relatively small. It was among these advantaged parents where we saw big differences between having two parents versus growing up in a single mother. And most notably, she found that differences in college attendance were moderate, differences in college completion were much more substantial.
So the legend suggests it's average parents. Is that correct? Or is it school, but it's only mothers?
She did a variety of measures. Average parents' education, for this particular graph, she actually averaged the years of education for mothers and fathers. But for folks that grew up persistently with single mothers, it was just maternal. And the results were pretty similar across all of them. And so that's where I'm picking up. I want to understand how much do these family structure differences for kids of socioeconomically advantaged families explain these income differences in a way that doesn't match theoretically with the predictions of the literature about either double disadvantage for disadvantaged kids or compensation between family structures at the high end. And so similar to Deirdre's paper, I'm using the NLSY 79, which was a cohort study that started with a nationally representative sample of approximately 12.6 thousand 14 to 21-year-olds in 1979. So this is a cohort of folks born in the late 50s, early 60s. The data continue to observe them through now the early mid-50s. And so I've measured a variety of kind of background characteristics and adult characteristics at various defined portions of the life course. And so obviously the key kind of explanatory variable here is family structure. And so I've measured it in a variety of ways, but I'm mostly following up on Deirdre's paper where she creates a binary variable for folks that grew up with two-parent families from birth to age 18 relative to those that did not. And these data are from a family history that was collected in 1988, where at every age from 0 up through 18, they asked respondents, did you live with X person at that particular age, where X person was biological mother, adoptive mother, stepmother, same for fathers, grandparents, other relatives, friends, group home, etc. And so for the folks that are counted in this two-parent group, it's folks that live with biological parents from birth to age 18, along with a small number of folks that grew up either with two adoptive parents or one biological parent and a step-parent or adoptive parent from birth all the way through age 18. Other folks are then counted in the kind of not two-parent group. And then there are a variety of other tests that I've done looking at time-variant measures of family structure. About 68% of the analytic sample was in this two-parent group. 32% were counted as the not two-parent families. Half of those grew up with a single parent for most of their years. About 30% grew up with a single parent and a step-parent. And then the remaining 20% of the not two-parent group was kind of some combination of other arrangements. So I'm looking at family structure mostly in the binary way, but with some additional measures that I'll talk about later for time variance. And then I measured parental education with just in the first year of the survey, what was the maximum number of years of education for either parent. So I am using not the average, but maximum for either parent. And then they collected that just in years of completed education. I turned it into categories for less than 12, 12 to approximate high school, 13 to 15 to approximate some college, 16 plus to approximate college. I also looked at it continuously. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot more detail about parents' education than that in the survey. And then parents' income was measured for the years that the respondents were co-resident with their parents from wave 1 through age 20. So I didn't want to over-represent late home leavers, so 22-year-olds that stayed in the parental home might be very different from some other kids. So I cut it off at age 20, and then I averaged parental income for all the years that folks co-resided with their parents. And then the additional restriction that I put on the sample was that folks in the sample had at least 2 measures of parental income. So I wanted to, as closely as possible, measure permanent income for parents. And so there's additional work by a variety of mobility folks showing that there's a lot of transitory variance in income, particularly if you're trying to measure parents' income with a single year of data. That transitory variance winds up biasing downward your persistence estimates for the association between parents and adult income. And so I restricted it to 2 parents in a variety of tests. The patterns look pretty similar when I don't do this, but this does yield more robust estimates of the association between parents and kids. And so parents' education, income, and family structure all kind of measured in this teen up to about age-ish, 20-ish years. And then I looked at children's educational attainment in a couple different ways. I looked at the maximum degree and the maximum number of years that children had attended school. But then I focused more specifically on college attainment. Specifically, did you get a college bachelor's degree by the age of 30? But also, did you ever enroll in college before the age of 30? And then conditional on the folks that ever report having enrolled in college, did you also attain a bachelor's by the age of 30? So I wanted to look at not just attainment of a degree, but are differences in attainment driven by differences in reaching and accessing college versus completing college among those that get there. And then I cut it off at age 30, which is the vast majority of respondents. Their education doesn't change past age 30, despite some returning students. And then I averaged child's adult income from ages 30 and upward. And so on average, when kids had their parents' income measured, they were about age 16, and there was about 3.4 observations of parental income. For children's income in adulthood, the average age was about 39, and the average number of observations was more than 10. So these are quite long-run measures of permanent income, which makes me think that these persistence estimates are relatively strong and robust. I also controlled for a variety of demographic characteristics that are arguably not post-treatment characteristics. I'm not trying to get causal estimates or anything here, but I don't want to downwardly bias anything. And so I condition on sex, race, mother's age, number of siblings, and region of residence in wave 1. So all of these are wave 1 characteristics, some of which might be before and after the family structure measures, but it's the best that the NLSY will provide. And then some additional analyses that I did were replicating these data with the newer cohort of the NLSY. So the NLSY 97, which is a nationally representative cohort study of kids aged 12 to 18 in 1997. So they're much younger, and there are a lot of big differences, social structural differences for that cohort relative to the 79. Education expanded, rates of single parenthood expanded, selectivity into single parenthood has arguably changed. The only difference in the measurement was that for the NLSY 97 cohort, the youngest are age 30. And so it's only right here that there's data. And so the income data is pretty limited to very kind of like early career, early adulthood, areas where I don't think that permanent income is really stabilized, but old enough that I think the vast majority of education has been completed. So I replicated some of these results with that. And there are a couple of differences that I think are pretty interesting to look at. Does anyone have questions about the data? Cool. All right. So, association between parents' income here on the x-axis and child's income up on the upper axis. For the results that I'll show, these are predicted relative income ranks in adulthood by parents' income quintiles. I also did this continuously with the intergenerational elasticity between logged parental and child incomes. But this allows for some nonlinearities that wind up being pretty substantively important. And then this dark rounder line is for kids that grew up in that two-parent group. And then the dashed line is for kids that grew up outside of the two-parent group. And so in the bottom 2 quintiles, there's no significant difference in adult income by childhood family structure, conditioning on sex, race, region of residence, et cetera. There's a significant but relatively smaller difference in that middle quintile, no difference at all in the 4th quintile, and then it's in the upper end. So this is just very similar to the descriptive figure that didn't have any demographic controls. The predicted difference in adult income is biggest for kids from the highest income parents. And it's a difference of about 10 income ranks in that top quintile. So it's about a full income decile that they differ by. And then when I add education to the model with just highest degree attained, the slope for parents' income on children's income is shallower, and then some of the differences are much smaller or kind of in a different direction than we would have anticipated. These are not significant differences, but children from non-two-parent families actually would have very slightly higher predicted adult income than children from two-parent families. Up at the top, this is now the only statistically significant difference across the different quintiles of parental income. Those growing up with two parents have about 5 income ranks higher in adult income than kids from non-two-parent families. So education explained just over half of that difference in the top quintile. And so that's kind of the first analysis, is showing college attainment predicts half of that difference. Okay, so now if I start looking at college degree as the outcome variable. So we would obviously expect the difference to be bigger for the higher income group, given the way that it moderated the difference for adult income. So again, we've got parental income quintile down here on the x-axis. On the y-axis, we have the predicted probability of attaining a bachelor's degree or higher by the age of 30. And all of these are conditional on demographic characteristics. Yes?
Are the quintiles for only college degree parents or for all parents?
These are for all parents. After this, I'll show some differences where I'm conditioning on parental education instead. Some things do look pretty different when I condition on parental education. And so the difference in the predicted probability of attaining a college degree is buried somewhere in here. I think it's about 18 percentage points, or yeah, 18 percentage points for this top quintile here. So there's a pretty profound difference here. And actually, the kids that grew up with two parents in the highest income quintile are like kind of arguably outliers relative to the rest. Like they have much higher degree levels of college attainment. Keep in mind that this is folks born in the late 50s, early 60s, and so college attainment is going to be lower for this cohort than it is for more recent cohorts. But yeah, there's this 18 percentage point gap by family structure in the top quintile. If I look at access to college, so the predicted probability of do you ever report being enrolled in college prior to the age of 30 with the same model specification. Again, the gap by family structure is biggest for those from the top income quintile. So folks growing up with two parents had a predicted probability about 16 percentage points higher of ever reporting being enrolled relative to folks that grew up outside of two-parent families. And then when I cut the sample down to just folks that ever report being enrolled. So this is among all respondents, this is among all respondents, this is just among folks that ever report being enrolled. What's the probability of walking away with a bachelor's degree by age 30? The family structure differences are a little more variable across income quintiles, but again, the difference between those with two parents versus without is biggest in the top income quintile. There's an 18 percentage point difference in the top group. And so if I'm trying to think about, in terms of college degree attainment, is the difference in enrollment or completion a bigger component of the family structure difference? You can just kind of very loosely take the product of the probability of enrolling and the probability of completing, and then do some adjustments by family structure to try to understand if I equalized between those with and without both parents, would college degree attainment for the non-two-parent kids look more similar if they had that level of enrollment or if they had that level of completion? The majority of the difference is due to completion. So it's close to 60% of the difference is due to differences in college completion. So it's not that, it's more so that kids from non-two-parent families are less likely to leave with a degree than it is that they're less likely to reach higher education in the first place. And so now it's replicating the same analysis, but this time I'm adding parents' education as a covariate, along with its interaction with childhood family structure. So in the earlier charts where I was showing adult income, when I included parents' education, it operated almost entirely through child's education. So parents' education predicted children's education predicted income. Other than that, there was not really much of a conditional association. That is not the case when it comes to predicting children's child education. So again, predicting the probability of attaining a bachelor's degree by age 30, all demographic controls, parents' income interacted with family structure, and then shown on the next slide, parents' education interacted with family structure. We still see that the gap for those with and without two parents is biggest for folks in the top income quintile. This time the gap is a little bit smaller. It's about 16 percentage points. What if we look at enrollment? Similar story. Again, the gap between them is biggest in the top income quintile relative to any of the other quintiles, where kids from two-parent families are less likely to enroll than folks from two-parent families. And then for college completion, the family structure difference, except for that second income quintile, is just a little bit more comparable across all of the income distribution. It's still largest in the top quintile relative to the other quintiles, but it doesn't seem like it's quite so anomalously large relative to low or middle income kids by family structure. So we're still seeing that there's bigger differences at the high end. For education, it looks a little bit more constant across the whole range of parental education when I'm also conditioning on parents' income. So for parents with less than 12 years, 13 to 15, 16 plus, the difference in the probability of attaining a college degree by age 30 for children is biggest at the very high end here. But then when I look at enrollments, it's actually quite comparable across this whole range except for 13 to 15. This is actually the only level of parental education for which the family structure difference is statistically significant. So at the high end, there's no difference in reaching higher education. And then when I look at college completion, it's kind of the inverse here. So we've got no statistically significant difference for that group, and then very comparable differences across the range of education. And so it's a bit of a different story for education relative to income, and then the pattern for family structure by income is also different when we condition on education. And part of what's going on here is that for the two-parent families, there's not so big a difference in the level of education within income quintiles between the two-parent families and the non-two-parent families. So parental education and income are kind of very similar up until we get to this kind of upper education group. And that's where we start to see a big divergence in income and education by family structure. And this is, I think, a two-income story. So in that upper group, there's much higher income for a comparable level of parents' education. And so it's the divergence of the association between parental education and income that causes this divergence in children's educational attainment by those two predictors. Okay, so what about in a more recent cohort, in the NLS Y97? Do things look profoundly different or similar? Between cohorts, so now this is a generation that was born somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 plus years later. This is the same kind of model. It's with demographic characteristics predicting children's income ranks. This time I've averaged income from age 28 plus, but this is by no means the same measure of permanent income for this younger cohort. Kids with two parents relative to kids that grew up without two parents. Again, the income difference is largest for those growing up with parents from the top income quintile, but there's more discernible family structure differentiation across the range of the income distribution. So we're now seeing that between generations there's more of a pulling up of the two-parent kids than there is for the non-two-parent kids. This is also a cohort where instead of 32% being in the non-two-parent group, it's more like 48%. So there's a big difference in terms of who is in these two different groups and then how far apart they are. Oh, yeah, I already have it. And then conditioning on education. Similar to the older cohort, college degree attainment explains about half of this income difference in that top quintile, but it also explains all of the difference down here in the bottom income quintile. So education has similar explanatory power here, but stronger explanatory power for the lower part of the parental income distribution. In terms of predicting college attainment, we've got much more differentiation here, higher levels of attainment just overall. So this cohort's just way more likely to go to college and finish college than the previous cohort. And again, we've got a big difference that's something on the order of like 38 percentage points or something like that for kids from the top income quintile. There's more of a discernible difference now at the bottom than there was in the older cohort, but relative to what that looks like at the top, way smaller. The income pattern, if I condition on parental education, is moderated and more kind of consistent across the range of the income distribution, but it's still largest and most significant at the top income quintile. So we're still predicting child's college attainment with parents' income, but now we've conditioned on education. Looking at the pattern of child's college attainment with parents' education. So now we're predicting probability of college with parents' education times family structure, still conditioning on parents' income. It's similar to the older cohort. We've got a more persistent, or not persistent, but consistent family structure difference across the range of parental income, or education. And we're still seeing a bit of that divergence of the parental income and education by family structure at that high end. And so that's kind of what's causing some of this apparent discrepancy between the income and education predictors. Also in the NLS Y97 cohort, I looked at things including parental wealth in the model. So unfortunately, the NLS Y79 did not include parental wealth as a measure. The NLS Y97 did, which was super cool. This is the same graph as before. I'm predicting college attainment with family structure times parental income. This is predicting college attainment with family structure times parental wealth, because both of these things have kind of independent effects on college attainment. The pattern is stronger for income in terms of this fanning out than it is for parental wealth, but the gap is still greatest among the wealthiest kids, not among the poorest kids. When I include both of these measures at the same time, the wealth pattern is a bit attenuated, but it's pretty consistent. The income pattern controlling for wealth is a little attenuated, but still biggest for the highest income kids. The wealth pattern, it's still a bigger difference here than in the other wealth quintiles, but it's a little bit more consistent across the wealth quintiles. I also did this with the PSID because I don't do things for fun, I guess, and it's a pretty similar story, but the wealth pattern is more consistent with the fanning out for the higher income or higher wealth kids than among the NLSY. And so overall, the kind of three take-home points are that we see family structure for at least adult education and income matters most among the highest income kids, not among the lowest income kids. For the adult income difference, college attainment explains about half of the family structure difference in that high range of parental income, and that college completion was a bigger component of that difference in college attainment than was college access. But they both contributed kind of, in meaningful ways. So to think about further mechanisms, like why does family structure matter? In Deirdre Bloom's article, she tested two different hypotheses using the family history data. First was about socialization-based theories. So is it years spent with two parents? Do parents have kind of more time for socializing children, passing on social, cultural capital, etc.? Or is it that non-two-parent families are more unstable? So when non-two-parent families dissolve or kids otherwise change living arrangements throughout childhood, it's very disruptive for their development, for their educational aspirations and trajectories, etc. She found that years with two parents actually didn't explain the family structure difference in income mobility that she found, but she found that the number of transitions between family types, so living with two biological parents one year, living with a single parent the next year, living with a single parent and a step parent the year after, those kinds of disruptions did explain the difference in downward mobility from the top. And so she attributed it to mostly of this disruption story. I find the same things looking at income, which is good because we're using the same data. But for college education, I did not find a clear-cut story. Years with two parents explain some portion of the family structure difference for college attainment, which makes us think that it's a socialization or cultural capital story. But family transitions also explained some minor portion of it. Neither one of them really explained the majority of the difference by family structure. So I think there's less of a clear story about which one of these two as potentially competing hypotheses makes sense. I also looked at self-reported reasons for leaving college. Kids from non-two-parent families were more likely, particularly at the high end of parental income, were more likely to say that they left for school reasons because they didn't like school or they were getting poor grades, or they were more likely to leave for work reasons, either that they had to stop going to school because they had to work or because they got a job that didn't require a college degree. For a younger cohort, I feel like there could be very different dynamics going on, but neither one of those two explanations really fully accounted for the difference in college attainment or college completion. Last thing, I did a little bit of stuff looking at marital stability and assortative mating. So to what extent is it that growing up without two parents, particularly at the high end, lessens the likelihood of being stably married and being in a dual earner couple, and then having a spouse that also has high earnings. All of those things are true. None of those things actually explain much of the residual pattern of what I found here. And so I'm still trying to think a little bit more about how I'm handling that to see if maybe there's some restrictions I'm putting in how I'm modeling it that aren't kind of showing the complexity of the family structure, adult family structure for the patterns in family income. Okay, so overall, last slide, promise. I just find limited evidence for double disadvantage, which is really important for kind of the public discourse around single parenthood and the reproduction of poverty intergenerationally. I find that among low-income parents, at least when it comes to children's education and then later adult income, family structure is not profoundly important for inheriting disadvantage intergenerationally. It is really important for inheriting advantage. And so instead of thinking of the low-income kids from single-parent families as being this especially disadvantaged group that's different from the rest of the population, we could actually think of the kids from two-parent families with high income as being somewhat of the outliers who are on average, the only ones that are able to successfully reproduce high levels of parental advantage into the next generation. So I think it's just a different way of kind of turning the issue on its head and thinking about the patterns that are at work. And these patterns are different from what the literature might otherwise focus on with teenage childbearing, dropping out of high school, labor force attachment, et cetera. Okay, that's it. Thanks. Do you know if that's, no, that's your bottle of water.
Yours, yeah.
Oh, is it? Oh, thank you very much. Yes, hi, thanks. Yeah.
This is also very interesting. I have a couple of questions. So one question is just thinking about how gender might play a role. So that most of these single parent households are basically single mother. And probably there isn't enough data to do that, but I would wonder how it would look if we were to run the analysis separately by like single parent, single father, single mother.
Yeah.
And then the other main question is, to what extent do you consider that there might be some kind of bias in considering the permanent income of the parents' household as permanent? Basically, I'm thinking that the in the category of non-two-parent households, that measure of permanent income might be a lot more noisier because it's just capturing in a couple of years. They might have recoupled by then, or less of a measure of permanent income than the two-parent household, basically. How that might play a role, especially in the like top quintile group, which might be more.
Yeah, definitely. I think so. First on the gender question. Yeah, there's very, very, very few single father households in the data, but I did break it out by single parent, biological parent and step parent, other association. There's a little bit of differences in kind of the extent of the adult income difference from the high income families. So in that chart where they're kind of fanning out as it goes into upper parental income. There are differences in the magnitude of those trajectories for the different family groups, but the qualitative pattern was the same. So for all of them, it was biggest at the top, and there was next to nothing at the bottom. Yeah, for the transitions in terms, or like the changes in family structure and trying to measure permanent income, yeah, there's not a ton of families in the data where from wave 1 to the maximum age that I observed parental income, I observed both change in family income and then could look at the impact of that on permanent income. If anything, I think, yeah, this measure of permanent income is like downwardly biasing some of the differences that we might otherwise observe between the non-two-parent and the two-parent families. So, you know, we would observe a much bigger income difference for them, like immediately post-family change or dissolution. If it's dissolution, we would observe a much bigger change for them relative to the two-parent group, versus if it was remarrying, it would be a much smaller change. So for the dissolution, the averaging for parent income downwardly biases the differences. For remarrying, it introduces, or not introduces, but it differentiates them more. That's worth looking into. Yeah. Yes?
Well, on the other side of that coin, what about the children's income that is male versus female? Did you look at that and see differences in the pattern?
I sure did. Okay. So here we've got, I did it separately, male-female, but then by basically folks that never married, unstably married, referring to like they spent some years being married and then subsequently spent some years not being married, or stably married. They married and then thereafter never reported not being married. I broke it out by sex, but it's actually pretty similar. But I did this for family income, and then subsequently I looked at earnings by sex, own earnings and spouse's earnings. And so for this, like it's among this unstably married group where we see this big difference. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the probability of being never married, unstably married, stably married. And so it's family structure. It's the high income folks without two parents that were much more likely to be unstably married than their peers that grew up in two-parent families, and then, of course, much less likely to be stably married. Education didn't actually explain much of that, because I was really focused on education as this mechanism. It didn't explain these differences in the marital patterns. But then when I include marital status categories throughout adulthood in the income model, it doesn't do a lot of attenuation for the pattern that I saw, but I also think maybe this is just more complex than adding those covariates. And then for earnings, I'm sorry, I don't remember if I have the chart. But yeah, there was a bigger difference for family structure moderating the association between parents' income and own earnings among men than there was for women. But for women, the association between parents' income and spouses' earnings was stronger. So for women, when they were growing up, their parents' income mattered a lot for what their eventual spouses' earnings were, particularly at the high end. For men, that wasn't the case. And then the reverse was true for men. Yeah?
Hi, I was wondering if it's, so your story seems to imply that one possible explanation is that in higher income or higher education groups, maybe the two-parent family is also possibly more normative, and maybe there's greater family social.
Yes, could be.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how common single-parent households are in each of your quintiles.
Yes, so particularly in the NLSY 79 cohort, in that upper quintile, oh gosh, I want to say it was somewhere in the ballpark of 10% or below. So yeah, absolutely a very different group, which means that there could also be very different underlying selection processes going on as well into family structure. In the NLSY 79, absolutely more common, but in the top quintile, but way more common down here in the bottom quintile. So I think in the 97 cohort, especially in the bottom quintile, the majority were from non-two-parent families. In the upper quintile, I don't know why I'm throwing out numbers when I don't know them, but just so as a ballpark, I want to say that it's on the order of 20-ish%. Yeah, there have been big changes in normativity for family structure that have varied significantly by quintile. That's a great point. Yes?
Very interesting. There is this discussion out there that says that the penalty to single parenthood is actually connected to institutional resources, welfare policies, and so I wonder about, do you have any regional variation in these effects? I mean, you don't present, but also it seems that you have a very clear that there's a very clear penalty in the recent data set, in the NLS1. So what explains that? Is it really just a change in the composition of the family structure groups, or does it connect with changes in family policies, welfare reform, and so how do you account for that?
Yeah, great question. I'm fairly familiar with this kind of welfare policy and single parenthood debate. Yeah, so for the changes across cohorts, I will admit that it's actually a little different than what I expected to be. I actually expected slightly smaller family structure differences in the younger cohort, just because selection processes have changed. So it was no longer that being in a single mother family was either like a product or a signal of disadvantage. And so there was much more like higher women's labor force participation, et cetera. I would have expected smaller differences. I think that this isn't actually what I wanted. But I think what's going on here is, particularly when we look at college, and so if you're trying to kind of imagine what the NLSY 79 figure looked like, then for both family structures, the probability of college attainment at the very bottom income quintile was very close to zero. It was below 10%. It was like 5% of these kids attained a college degree. And then obviously it went up, but even among the two-parent group, it kind of capped out where these non-two-parent kids were in the younger cohort. So I think what's going on in terms of that is that there was a changing selection process, and I think in a way that weakened the correlation between like childhood poverty and childhood family structure. But in terms of education, we've got educational expansion pulling up the kids from the two-parent groups, particularly the high-income two-parent groups, much more rapidly than it pulled in the kids from the non-two-parent group. And then this slope is actually even much stronger. And so I think it's just that as higher education expanded, the degree to which access was unequal also expanded. And so I think it introduced more differentiation, even though rates of higher education increased kind of across the board. That's kind of my suspicion with respect to these specific mechanisms. Kind of in a broader sense, yeah, I don't know, just because I think for folks in this kind of upper part of the income distribution, I don't feel like there's ever been a lot of policy support for single-parent families. Well, I will say, like, in a normative sense in the United States, like, support for single-parent families is generally relatively low compared to other countries. And then to the extent that it's existed, it's sometimes been mainly targeted here and often been relatively meager anyway. And so I don't know, for the patterns of differentiation at the top, how much I really think changes in welfare policy support have impacted anything. It's a hunch. Yes?
I was wondering if you find any differences by race ethnicity in this type of family structure.
Mm-hmm. A little bit. Oh, sorry. There's got to be a way to, oh, there they are. Yeah, so it's, this is NLSY 79, that basic descriptive pattern where we've got parents' income percentile rank, child's income percentile rank, and then this line here is two parents, this line is not two parents. For both white and black children, the difference was greatest at the high end, very little difference at the low end. But for the Latino respondents, there was actually no difference by childhood family structure. And so in these bigger patterns where we're talking about family structure differences, we're actually just talking about the white and black respondents. And I haven't looked at this yet with NLSY 97. And it could just be, like, I haven't dug deeply enough to look at what are these non-two-parent forms, so there could just be quite a bit more extended kin support in this group relative to others. Yes?
So for your graph where you have the instability measure, have you thought about like taking more of a life course perspective and thinking about like a divorce as kind of a shock, and then looking at basically someone's probability before and after a divorce as a measure for, you know, whether or not they either go to college or drop out of college? Because if it is really if it's a, you know, social stress, then that you should be able to see that in that kind of analysis, using basically the separation or the instability as a measure of, you know, life change.
Yes. There was a time somewhere in the midst of me working on this that I tried to narrow down family changes in family transitions, not necessarily specifically at divorce, but by age, in like the teenage years versus earlier years. I want to say that it was similar, but it looked a little stronger when it happened in the teen years than when it happened earlier, but I don't remember clearly enough.
More sense if you're layering that on with income, and then what's more prevalent, right? So if being all of a sudden in a single parent household is less common in people in the upper income rank, and it's happening to them as teenagers,
yeah,
it's going to have a much bigger potential psychological effect than if it's normal for everyone and it's happening, right? I mean, just from a sociological perspective.
Yeah, I definitely thought about it in like high school years as potentially like derailing educational aspirations, et cetera. Yeah, I can revisit that because I think it's important. I off the top of my head, I can't remember what I clearly found, but yeah. Yes.
So I guess that is part of what you're saying. So, determinants of divorce are likely to differ a lot by quintile, but also probability of remarriage.
Yes.
So I guess on one hand, how does that figure in your analysis and then into explanations? Because presumably, if I understood correctly, you measure marital dissolutions in childhood, and some fraction will remarry, and sometimes fairly quickly. I didn't see that kind of incorporated both on the analysis, but also conceptually.
Yes. So So eventual remarriage, I didn't look at, I'm only measuring family transitions up through age 18. So anything that happened after age 18, I didn't have as part of my measure because it wasn't part of the data. And so like the NLSY couldn't tell me after age 18 what happened to somebody's family structure because they just went from birth to that age. Prior to age 18, so like this pattern when I break it down by the not two parents and the two parents, like the association did look very similar. So all of the not two parent groups were kind of similar along this line here. But what was different was that where the parents fell in the income distribution. So the single parents were more likely to be down at the bottom. The single and step, or one biological and one step parent or something like that were more likely to be up closer to the middle of the income distribution. So it mattered for the level of parental income. I didn't observe it mattering as much for the association between this measure of parental and child's income. For the instability analysis, I didn't break out family transitions by type, so I didn't disaggregate between parental dissolution, like marital dissolution versus remarriage. And so I think it's very likely that the remarriage would be less disruptive than marital dissolution as a hunch, but I haven't looked at it yet. It's worth looking into though.
I mean, part wondering about child outcomes, it presumably matters if parents divorce and then remarry quickly thereafter or remain.
Oh, so also looking at the timing of dissolution and remarriage, you mean? Yes. Yeah, that's worth looking into. Yeah, yes?
I wonder if you might want to experiment with your income measure and try a measure like income per adult equivalent in the household.
Yeah.
Which, the way you're doing it now, a 3-person household with 2 adults earning $50,000 a year is treated exactly the same as a $50,000 household with 1 adult and 2 children. In fact,
that's right.
Is better off because children's consumption needs are substantially lower. So I think
yes, that's right.
Might be interesting.
Yeah, I followed the cross-national literature that often just uses square root of household size. And that's what Deirdre did in her paper. But yeah, I think an equivalent scale would be very different. I also introduced a measure or a control for dual earner versus not dual earner, and I didn't notice things being profoundly different. But I think trying to get at that same question of the number of sources or what have you, or number of people with different income needs might be varied.
One of your control variables was the number of siblings.
Yes.
How did that work? That might be affected by this comparison of income.
Yeah, so I mean, the patterns are really similar with and without that particular control. It was just in wave 1, number of co-residential biological siblings, including half-siblings.
Did siblings inhibit or
negative for adult income? Yeah, so those with larger family sizes have lower adult incomes growing up. And I think, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, I'd have to double check. I think part of it operated through education, that there was just a dilution of family resources for funding college education was a big part of it, but I'm not sure. Yeah?
Great talk. So I wonder if you could, if you are able to look at parental family or the family structure at birth.
So to distinguish mothers who are unpartnered at the time of birth versus those who go on to get divorced, because I think that would signal different mechanisms in different ways, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Whether it's a social stress mechanism or sort of a more something else.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I didn't look at that. Deirdre looked at it some in her paper, where she, when she was looking at family transitions versus years spent with two parents, because there were a relatively small number of kids that grew up in a non-two-parent family, but experienced no family transitions throughout their entire childhood. So family composition didn't change at all, and most of them were single mother from birth. And she found that for adult income, they were pretty much on a par with the two-parent families, conditional on parental income. But the number of them was pretty small. Yeah, I think I think a lot of the questions are getting at disaggregating some of these composition changes instead of lumping them together. Yeah, I agree. I think that kind of transitions from birth would be different.
All right, well, that's thank you again.
All right, cool. Thanks.